Hello, History 72B Spring Quarter 2023. The one thing I wanted to say today is that I have been really happy with your answers on the quizzes. I've been reading them, and you all are a very thoughtful group. Package E is a small package that I decided to split away from Package D, which I felt was getting a bit too long. So Package E is a mini package that just covers the Great Depression and New Deal fairly quickly. We will start looking at the Great Depression in the industrial East, then move westward through the Great Plains and on to the western half of the U.S., considering how the Great Depression affected women in these different situations. We know from previous lectures that working class women worked outside the home and that numbers went up to include more married women during World War I. Nonetheless, the working class were saddled with often non-livable wages, combined with the expectation that a proper man should be a breadwinner and support his family financially. I stated in the last lecture that despite the roaring economy and massive increase in consumer goods, the 1920s were a time of extreme income inequality, and we're looking at levels of income inequality here. You can ignore Europe and focus mainly on the US, which is the darker line. This was true not just in the US, but in Europe as well, and after World War I, the US and the European economies were linked. Farmers in both Europe and the US overproduced during World War I, and in the wake of the war, prices plummeted. Farmers couldn't afford to pay debts on equipment and defaulted on loans. Consumer goods increased in production, but the wages of the laborers stayed stagnant. Goods stockpiled rather than selling, and factories started closing down. With fewer jobs, there was less ability to consume and drive the economy, leading to a disastrous cycle of lost jobs, foreclosure, business failure, and more lost jobs. The stock market crash of 1929 is now considered a symptom rather than a cause of the spiral into the Great Depression. But to people on the ground in the US, that was less important than the reality of losing jobs, homes, and farms. By the early 1930s, something in excess of 14 million Americans, that represents a quarter of the workforce, were out of jobs, and another 40 million were working poor, meaning that they did not make enough money to meet their obligations. Between 1929 and 1932, families lost more than 30% of their income on average, with minority families hit the hardest. You will notice that this line of unemployed men is just that, all men. Men without work counted as unemployed. Women often did not. As the industrial workforce contracted, employers fired women first, with the logic that their work had always been temporary and supplemental, with a man as the main breadwinner. This hit everyone hard, but you can see, I hope, that it created a nearly impossible situation for women raising a family alone, even if they had been widowed by, say, the First World War. In a reverse of the situation during the war, where women and people of color were able to move to higher-paying industrial jobs, white women in industry moved to domestic labor, forcing Black women who had been in those jobs out of work completely or leaving them to be hired sporadically as day laborers. To add to the disaster taking shape for farmers, a series of intense, gigantic dust storms stripped soil from farms in the Great Plains of the US and Canada during the 1930s. It is difficult for me to get my head around the sheer size of so-called Dust Bowl storms, so I find that images are critical. In this one, you can see the size of the cloud of dust about to envelop this small town. The buildings appear relatively larger because they are in the foreground, and they are still dwarfed by the coming storm. This is a house after a dust storm has passed through, and you can just sort of see probably a barn or a silo just off the edge here. And this is what was left of a farm. Even those who might have been able to hold on to their land during financial difficulties saw crops destroyed and livelihoods utterly lost in a day. California was pretty much unscathed by the Dust Bowl, so many displaced farmers headed to California to try to keep their families alive. Meanwhile, in California, if you read the Forgotten Worker piece, which is for both last package and this one, since I kind of split the last package, then you know something of what was happening in California when these displaced white farmers began to arrive. But I will catch you up just in case. Prior to the 1920s, the southern border with Mexico was extremely porous, and while forced out of panning for gold, Mexican agricultural laborers could cross the border, especially to escape war in Mexico. And this is a big and, Americans with Mexican ancestry lived on and worked their own land. These were American citizens, both by the agreement at the end of the Mexican-American War and by the 14th Amendment, having been born on U.S. soil, many of them. For migrant workers who went from harvest to harvest, life was fairly abysmal. They were paid very little, forced to live on a farmer's land while they worked, and then charged rent for where they built temporary shelter. Water had to be hauled in, and children had no option for education, even as grade school became compulsory for Anglo-American children. I've taken both photo and quote from a California history site. The group in the image is picking apricots. This was taken in 1935. The quote is from a farm owner, not of the pictured farm, but the attitude was the same. When, quote, "They have finished harvesting my crops, I will kick them out on the country road. My obligation is ended." By the 1920s, at least 3/4 of California's 200,000 agricultural workers were Mexican or Mexican-American. Landowners generally did not differentiate. The restrictive immigration law of 1924 hit Mexican immigrants, but the U.S. did form its first labor agreement with Mexico. Mexico asked the U.S. farm owners to provide legal contracts for Mexican workers, guaranteeing wages and work schedules. In turn, the U.S. began policing the border with Mexico, checking that farm laborers had this work contract, ostensibly so they would not be exploited, but in reality, as an assertion of power. The quote on this slide, again from the California history site, gives an idea of how anxious white agricultural owners were to claim cheap, exploitable labor and to justify that in racialized terms. So here is the quote. "I do not want to see the condition arise again when white men who are reared and educated in our schools have got to bend their backs and skin their fingers to pull those little beets." Those would be sugar beets. "You can let us have the only class of labor that will do the work or close the beet factories because our people will not do it, and I say frankly, I do not want them to do it." And that would be a representative of the Sugar Beet Growers Association. The arrival of white workers fleeing the Dust Bowl, however, made an already precarious situation even worse for Mexican and Mexican-American workers, because now suddenly these white people were willing to bend their backs. White unions claimed that all jobs should go to the white people flooding into the state. When Mexican and Mexican-American labor organized, they were met with violence even greater than industrial strikers in the Northeast. California's state and local governments came up with what were called repatriation plans. Anyone who looked Mexican to police could be arrested and sent to Mexico, and this included American citizens. If you have read the Forgotten Worker piece, then you know that the intent on the part of the farm owners was never to give jobs to white workers, but to terrorize Mexican and Mexican-American workers and to stoke the anger of displaced whites, to keep the cycle of low wages, exploitation, and violence going. So, where did women fit into this? The answer is everywhere. Women worked in the fields. Women cared for the children in the fields. Women sought to make hovels into homes, and women participated in labor actions. There are many stories, but I am choosing two as illustrations: the Santa Clara Cannery Strike of 1931 in California and the pecan sheller strike of 1938 in San Antonio, Texas. Cannery work was temporary seasonal migrant work. Canneries might employ more than 17,000 workers at harvest in August, and then fewer than 5,000 in February. Employees were paid on a piecework basis, meaning on how much they got done, not on the hours worked. 10 to 12 hours was a standard workday. In 1931, cannery workers included white, Mexican American, and Mexican workers. Employers chose mainly women, saying that they were more dexterous in preparing vegetables and fruits for canning. Of course, women would be paid less, despite apparently being more skilled. The Great Depression saw a decrease in demand for luxury goods like canned fruit. We tend not to think of that as a luxury good now, but during the Depression and during the 1930s, it was when fresh fruit could not be gotten out of season. The drop in demand came just when there was an influx of desperate potential workers. In July of 1931, cannery owners announced a 20% cut in workers' wages. Over 16,000 cannery workers in Santa Clara walked off the job. Employers responded with strike breakers hired from the Depression desperate, and typically they responded with violence. One unarmed woman who stood up to speak at a rally was hit in the face with a tear gas bomb. Others were arrested. Men armed with machine guns threatened women who tried to protest close to plants, now filled with strikebreakers. This particular strike was unsuccessful, but the AFL, American Federation of Labor, did wake up to the need and organize cannery unions that would lead to more strikes throughout the 1930s. 7 years later, another group of Hispanic women led a strike in Texas. In the 1930s, San Antonio alone produced 50% of American pecans. Once again, the rationale for hiring women was that they were both quicker and more careful, but the reality was lower pay for a job. Desperate workers would take 10-hour shifts 7 days a week. Although mechanized shelling was available, employers in San Antonio preferred human shellers because they could keep wages low and increase profits more than investing in mechanization, as pecan sellers in other regions had done. Pecan shellers periodically protested conditions and pay, and beginning in the 1930s tried to organize a union, but in every instance they were crushed by a combination of employers and San Antonio officials like police. However, in 1937, the new Congress of Industrial Workers, that's a larger union, chartered the Texas Pecan Shelling Workers Union. In San Antonio, union members formed Local 172. In January of 1938, Southern pecan contractors implemented a nearly 20% pay cut to already starvation wages. Thousands of shellers walked off the job as soon as they heard, including Local 172. Under the leadership of the newly elected 22-year-old Emma Tenayuka, Local 172 called for union recognition, collective bargaining rights, and arbitration before the pay cut would go into effect. Over the course of 6 weeks, Tenayuka and thousands of others were arrested and booked into overcrowded cells. The image on the slide is Tenayuka and another union leader beside her there at their arrest. Not just the police and city leaders, but the Catholic Archbishop condemned the strike, as did local news sources. I will remind you that the shellers were requesting union recognition and arbitration in the cut to an already unlivable wage. Despite the tear gas and threats, the strike continued, and both the American national press now and the Mexican government took a dim view of owners in San Antonio when police clubbed a 60-year-old woman carrying her grandchild past a factory. Labor Secretary, this would be National Labor Secretary, Frances Perkins condemned ownership, and members of women's groups investigated the treatment of jailed female strikers. The governor pressured the owners to accept arbitration, and arbitrators sided with the strikers. On the one hand, this was a victory in a way the much earlier cannery strike had not been, and the pecan sheller strike drew national and international attention. On the other hand, San Antonio pecan wholesalers quietly automated their plants once the attention had died down, and Local 172 ceased to exist. Key points for Lecture 16, Module E or Package E. The roaring economy of the 1920s masked growing income inequality, leaving the working class especially vulnerable during the Great Depression as jobs disappeared and wages dropped. Many industrial employers fired women workers first, under the assumption, often untrue, that they would be supported by a breadwinner husband. White women took domestic labor jobs, pushing Black women even more to the fringes of the economy during the Great Depression. Massive dust storms pushed Midwestern farmers west into California, leaving them competing with Mexican and Mexican-American migrant workers for jobs that whites had previously shunned. Prior to the 1920s, the border that the U.S. shares with Mexico was not heavily policed. This ended in 1924, although agricultural laborers were welcomed in the U.S. until the Great Depression hit. The owners of large farms or ranches in California were happy to play off migrant Mexican and Mexican-American laborers and white laborers, displaced Midwestern farmers, against one another. Women in all of these groups joined in agricultural labor while also caring for children and home. White agricultural employers would have both Mexicans and Mexican Americans, American citizens, deported, so that fear would keep the remainder working for starvation wages. Agricultural laborers responded by forming unions and striking. Employers and local police worked together, often violently, to crush strikes. Women worked in fields and orchards. Women joined these strikes. Women were shot at, and sometimes women were killed along with men. Women led a strike at a cannery in California in 1931. The strike was unsuccessful, but it opened the door for union formation and future strikes. In 1938, women led a more successful strike in San Antonio, Texas, against pecan wholesalers. The strike forced owners to recognize the pecan shellers' union and to bargain with them. Owners then replaced human pecan shellers with a mechanized system. The pecan tree is actually a species of hickory. Pecans are native to the American South and parts of northern Mexico. The word pecan comes from the Algonquin, and it is a word with regional and interregional variations in pronunciation. There is no single agreed-upon correct pronunciation, although clearly pecan is the best because that is how I say it. The pecan fruit grows in clusters, and what we consider the nut is exposed as the hulls dry out and split open. They've made these pecans look pretty for the picture, but in addition to the hard outer shell, pecans have extremely bitter membranes that have to be cleaned out of all of the grooves. I have hated shelling and cleaning pecans since I was a small child, and relatives that I never met would send a bushel at winter holidays. Once cleaned, pecans can be delicious. I am particularly fond of them in pralines, or pralines if you prefer. Apparently, pecans are quite valuable, and there are thieves now who steal entire truckloads. Unfortunately, once the pecans are in stores, it is impossible to tell if you are purchasing bootleg pecans. Caveat emptor, or buyer beware.